Good evening and welcome to this year's presidential address. My name is Alex Hires. I'm an assistant professor in the history of U.S. education at the University of Utah. It is truly an honor to introduce Professor Derrick P. Alridge for this year's presidential address. Professor Alridge is a professor at the University of Virginia School of Education. At UVA School of Education, he serves as the director for the Center on Public Education in the South. He is the author of The Educational Thought of W.E.B. Du Bois and Intellectual History. He is also the author of several articles in the History of Education Quarterly, Teachers College Record, the Journal, and the Journal of African American History. Finally, and most importantly for tonight, he is director of the Teachers in the Movement Oral History Project. For those of you who don't know, I am a former advisee of Professor Alridge, and by former, I mean less than 2 years ago. Despite living thousands of miles away, Professor Alridge's influence continues to shape my writing, thinking, teaching, and mentorship. Each time I tell a graduate student in one of my courses to just write the story, I think of the many times he has said that to me and others. In 2014, my partner and I left the San Francisco Bay Area and moved to Charlottesville, Virginia. We did not move to Charlottesville for the wine and food, although that turned out to be much better than expected. And we did not move to Charlottesville to be in proximity to Thomas Jefferson and his university. No, ultimately we moved to Charlottesville so I had the chance to work with Professor Alridge and what would become the Teachers in the Movement Project. I started working on the project almost immediately upon arrival. In his mentorship, Professor Alridge practices what I like to call radical trust, although some others would call it throwing you in the deep end and see if you can swim. So just a few months into my time at UVA, he entrusted me and my colleague Lindsay Jones to help conduct one of the first interviews for the project. With the camera and lighting gear in tow, he drove us over near Charlottesville High School to the home of local educator, Mrs. Florence Coleman Bryant. Mrs. Bryant started her career at the segregated Jefferson School in the 1940s before retiring as an administrator at Charlottesville High in the 1980s. Across several decades, Mrs. Bryant had a firsthand view of the many struggles and changes for Black teachers and students in the Charlottesville city schools throughout the 20th century. Little did I know at the time that Bryant would become a central figure in my dissertation and in many ways the type of educator that Professor Alridge was trying to account for within the historical record. No, on that day, I was stressed about being respectful to the home of Mrs. Bryant, about making sure the camera was on and continued to work throughout the interview, and about asking the right follow-up questions when thrust into the position as interviewer. Since that interview with Mrs. Bryant, it has been amazing to see the evolution of the project, and you're going to see that here in a moment. From just a handful of interviews in the beginning where we were just trying to get a handle on the project, it has grown to hundreds of interviews with teachers. And within those interviews, teachers have shared a range of experiences in the classroom, including how they taught and what they taught across time and space in the South. So while tonight's address marks both a significant moment for the project, it also gives us the opportunity to see how far it has come. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Alridge to the podium.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you, Professor Hires, for your very kind introduction. I can't tell you all how special it is for me to be introduced by Professor Hires. As he mentioned, he was my advisee while he was a doctoral student at UVA, and he was an outstanding student. Let me say that for the record. But I also need to say that he is right. We set out on this project several years ago, and we knew that we wanted to conduct 500 videotape interviews of teachers. We really did not know what we were doing at first. And I threw Alex and Lindsay right into the middle of it, and they stepped up to the plate. So thank you, Alex. And thank you for your kind introduction again. Special thanks also to our program chair, Yoon Park, for her outstanding job in coordinating the stellar program. Let's give her a round of applause. And thanks to my many friends, you all, and several of my friends who drove all the way here to hear my presidential address. There are too many of them to name, so I'm not going to name them, but thank you. And last but certainly not least, thank you to my wife, Lori Alridge, right here, for her constant support and her technical so thank you so much. So I really appreciate you all attending my presidential address this evening. Over the last few days, a number of you have come up to me and said, well, I'm looking forward to your address. Are you nervous? And I said, I'm getting nervous now. But anyway, I really appreciate all of your support. And so this evening, I want to talk to you about a project that's near and dear to my heart. It is a project still in progress, and it's called Teachers in the Movement, Pedagogy, Activism, and Freedom. So allow me to begin with a video clip of the project.
Let us march on segregated schools. Let us march until every vestige of segregated and inferior education becomes a thing of the past.
You won't hear me use an integrated system because I maintain that schools were never truly, even today, were truly integrated.
When they finally decided to put the schools together and move the black teachers, they reinforced what we already knew. The black teachers were the most highly educated.
Everybody didn't agree with the fact that the school was being integrated. People like Coach Bingley here, who I love dearly, and they were somehow able to endure when I'm sure it was a great deal of pressure from the outside to not play black players. The way I like to look at it is they played fair ball. A lot of people didn't play fair ball in those days, but on that football team, we learned how to play fair ball.
In 1968, there were 122 black high school principals. In 1970, there were only 17. Because that fall, under court orders, all of the schools had to be desegregated.
And I always heard of the doctrine of separate but equal. I found that was the farthest thing from the truth. I was teaching science classes. I only had 2 microscopes for 6 classes of students, but determined that my students would get the education that they needed to be successful.
So the video clip that you just saw is a sample of the interviews we've conducted for this project. Now I want to share with you the genesis of the project, and it all begins with my youth in South Carolina. Growing up in Rock Hill, South Carolina in the 1970s, I belonged to Liberty Hill Missionary Baptist Church in Catawba, South Carolina, where I often heard the stories of local teachers' involvement in the American Civil Rights Movement. I knew many of these teachers personally through our interactions in the community. I was especially inspired by the story of an event that occurred in January of 1961, when students at the local Friendship Junior College sat in at a McCrory's lunch counter to protest segregated lunch counters and businesses in Rock Hill. After being refused service, the students were arrested and instead of paying bail, chose to serve 30 days in the York County Jail. These students were called the Friendship 9. The Jail No Bail campaign, as it was called, was legendary in my youth, and it marked an important moment in the Civil Rights Movement. One of the students who served time was a man named William Dub Massey, a legendary teacher and community leader in Rock Hill. And if you're looking up here, William Dub Massey is the gentleman sitting down. Massey later became a 6th grade teacher at Jefferson Elementary in York, South Carolina, and it was his work in the community as an educator and community activist that inspired many to pursue education in the field. Mr. Massey and many other educators in my hometown paved the way for me to eventually become a middle school and high school social studies and history teacher, a professor in a school of education, and a historian of education. For decades, my interest in teachers like Mr. Massey has made me contemplate the following questions. What is activism? Did teachers engage in activism through their teaching during the civil rights and post-civil rights eras? If so, why? And how did they practice activism? If not, why not? These questions have been foundational in my work over the past 5 to 6 years as the principal investigator of a large oral history project titled Teachers in the Movement, Pedagogy, Activism, and Freedom. The project is scheduled, as I mentioned earlier, to collect 500 videotaped interviews of teachers who taught between 1950 and 1980. Thus far, we have interviewed a little over 250 250 teachers. We are also collecting teaching materials, memorabilia, and other documents and resources that these teachers used during their careers. At the intersection of oral and intellectual history, my project claims that many K-12 educators and college and university professors engaged in forms of activism through pedagogical approaches that vigorously promoted ideals of freedom, democracy, and liberation. Collecting oral histories from these teachers has given me a glimpse into their classrooms to discern exactly how they were teaching. And I honed the research question to the following. Who were the elementary, secondary, and post-secondary teachers in the movement? What, how, and why did these teachers teach? How did notions of freedom manifest themselves in teachers' pedagogy? Who and what influenced teachers' pedagogy and participation in the movement? And how can recovering these teacher stories inform and impact education today? And one of the questions I'm often asked when I present on this research is, so how are you defining activism? We define activism as teachers express support of the civil rights movement and the deliberate championing of freedom and equality in their teaching or community work. So I want to introduce you to some of the teachers in my study and share with you their narratives of activism. But before I do that, I want to mention something else. And that is, when I set out on this work, and I really became interested in studying teachers, probably about 10 to 15 years ago, I started reading what were historians writing about teachers. And it wasn't that much. Some civil rights scholars, activists, and even organizations had characterized, when I first started getting interested in this, teachers, particularly black teachers, as unsupportive of the civil rights movement and as opposed to school desegregation. These historians sometimes argued that teachers were more interested in maintaining their positions in segregated schools and their status in the community. They were more interested in doing that than in advancing civil rights. This misconception, I believe, has obscured or maligned the roles of teachers in the movement, creating the perception that teachers were at best at its periphery, at worst actively resistant to it. This view is inaccurate, yet pervasive in some civil rights historiography. However, there have been some scholars who have been pushing back on this narrative. And you can read the work of individuals like Vanessa Walker, Tondra Loder Jackson, Scott Baker, Karen Johnson, Sonia Ramsey, Adar Randolph, John Hill, Alex Hires, and these are some of the scholars who named now are some of the younger scholars. Alex Hires, Jarvis Gibbons, and I'm sure I've left out many others. But this work has really inspired me and led me to believe that I think we're on the right track. But I wanted to do something a little different with teachers in the movement, though. And that is, we know that teachers were engaged in activism. And some of them were engaged in the community. But what were they doing inside the classrooms between 1950 and 1980? What were teachers doing? What materials were they using? How were they teaching? What influenced their teaching? And so this is what we're trying to learn. And these questions are the kinds of questions we ask teachers when we talk with them. So our research has taken us to large cities like Charlotte, North Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Richmond, Virginia, but also to small towns and hamlets like Danville, Virginia, Chester, South Carolina, Stanton, Virginia, Lynchburg, Virginia, Elizabeth City, North Carolina, and many other places throughout the South. As I travel, I often think of the experiences of W.E.B. Du Bois when he was a student at Fisk and when he was a teacher in a black rural Tennessee school in the late 1880s, a mere 40 years removed from slavery. Recounting this period in the souls of black folk, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote these words, these beautiful words. Once upon a time, I taught in the school in the hills of Tennessee, where the broad, dark fell of the Mississippi begins to roll and crumple to greet the Alleghanies. I was a Fisk student then, and all Fisk men thought that Tennessee, beyond the veil, was theirs alone. So as I travel to small towns throughout the South, I often imagine Du Bois' experiences in Tennessee. And I also realize how privileged I am to have teachers share with me their lives, their stories, and their participation in the Civil Rights Movement. One of the first teachers that we interviewed was a woman named Johnny Fullerwinder, and you saw Johnny Fullerwinder in the video clip. And I learned of Miss Fullerwinder from a student, undergraduate student named Chantelle White. Who's also from Danville. And when I went to the interview, of course we do our background, background information. We go in ready, prepared. But I don't know why I was a little bit nervous about this interview because, after doing my search on her on the internet, she's a very renowned educator in Danville. But when I got in her house, when we walked through the door, I noticed splashes of pink and green around her home. And I said, all right, let's see what's up with this. And I said, Mrs. Fullerwinder, and she's a very dignified person, very formal. I said, are you a member of any sorority? She said, yes, I am a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. All right, so that led us to start having more conversation. We were warming up to each other before the interview. Then I said, you're from Spartanburg. I know some people from Spartanburg. And we started talking about families that we knew. I said, I wonder if her husband's in a fraternity. And I said, Miss Fullerwinder, is your husband in a fraternity? She said, yes, he is. I said, which one is it? She said, he's a member of Omega Psi Phi. I said, okay. So, because I'm a member of Omega Psi Phi, I told her. And I also told her that my mother was a member of AKA sorority. So, this is what, you learn in graduate school when you're taking your research courses that you need to build rapport. And that's what I was trying to do. So I used that to my advantage. Fullerwinder graduated from Carver High School in Spartanburg, then headed to Salisbury, North Carolina to attend Livingstone College on an academic scholarship. As in Spartanburg, Jim Crow was ever present in Salisbury. Nevertheless, Fullerwinder found that her Livingstone professors, like her high school teachers, were dedicated to the intellectual enrichment of their students. At Livingston, she chose to major in teaching with a focus in science, and she graduated from Livingston in 1962. Fullerwinder returned to Carver High School in Spartanburg, but this time as a teacher. As in many black schools in the South, Carver's resources were minimal. Teachers had no access to mimeograph machines, so they wrote their lessons longhand on the board. Textbooks were old and outdated, having been discarded by white schools, and Fullerwinder remembered having only 2 microscopes for 6 classes of students. Yet despite these challenges, she believed that the school had a very rich culture and support. She talked about that. And as Vanessa Siddle Walker and Tondra Loda Jackson tell us, teachers in all black schools with few resources nevertheless provided students with a culturally relevant education, intellectual nourishment, and a sense of racial pride. Such intangibles were essential for Black students to succeed in the context of a Jim Crow society. In 1966, Fullerwander left Carver for George Washington High School in Danville, Virginia, which is in the southern part of the state. As the first African-American teacher at George Washington, Fullerwander encountered racism daily. After the first teachers' meeting, teachers walked off without her, and she was left standing alone. And she told me that she often felt invisible and ignored by her fellow teachers. And it was very painful for her to recount the story. During the first 2 weeks at the school, she was often mocked by some of her students. And on one occasion, students held their noses as she passed their desk, insinuating that she smelled. In the face of such challenges, Fullerwander made it clear to her students that her goal as their teacher was to help them become better science students. She informed them that although she was Black, race would not be a topic of discussion in their classwork. The resources Fullerwander had access to at George Washington contrasted starkly to those at Carver. At George Washington, she had 50 to 60 microscopes, new textbooks, paper for teachers, and mimeograph machines, and she could order any specimens she needed for class dissections. Fullerwander's pedagogy emphasized experiential engagement, and she told me that she was influenced by the writings of John Dewey. She utilized hands-on activities and did very little lecturing. She took students to the library and on field trips to experience science beyond the classroom and in the field. Word of her teaching approach spread around the school, and as a result, students began to request her as their science teacher in subsequent semesters. Like other teachers in the Jim Crow era, Fullerwander understood that she must be exemplary to gain respect for her teaching, what some people might call politics of respectability today. And I asked her about that, and she said, no, that's just what you had to do. You had to be the best. And she noted that I was not going to be outdone. I would show that Black teachers were able to do an effective job of teaching students regardless of their race. Over time, Fullerwander decided to reach out to fellow teachers. And she observed that teachers began to admire her teaching skills, and they began to talk to her. And although she did not see herself as an activist in a traditional sense, she recognized in my interview with her that the commitment she made to George Washington's first Black teacher and her efforts to provide her students with the best education possible were in fact forms of activism. Her experiential approach of taking students, again, outside the classroom to conduct science experiments in the real world, regardless of their race, she believed was a form of activism. During the years of segregated schooling, however, white teachers also taught students in the South. And this was something that when I first set out to do this study, the focus was going to primarily be on African-American teachers. But when I would interview the African-American teachers, I would say, all right, can you give me a list of teachers that I absolutely positively needed to interview? I said, okay. They say, okay, and then give me the teachers' names. And when we would go to wherever we would get a public library, the teacher would walk in, would be a white teacher. And they often told me that these teachers were some of the best teachers in their schools, and these were in segregated schools and desegregated schools. So Nancy Samuels was a teacher that I was very impressed by. In 1965, Samuels graduated from Stafford High School and enrolled in Lynchburg College. There she became involved in activism, including protesting the local newspaper's exclusion of Black obituaries. She also protested with fellow student white churches' refusal to accept Black parishioners. Her experiences at Lynchburg College and her exposure to students from the North had a strong influence on Samuels and her subsequent pedagogy as a classroom teacher. In 1968, Samuels became a teacher at Brookland Elementary School in Wright County, Virginia. And Wright is a suburban school, was a suburban school district with a predominantly white student population. During this period, she met her future husband, Derrick, who was African American. Despite concerns from her family, the two continued their relationship and eventually married. Reflecting back on that time, Samuels recalls her bewilderment at her family's concerns about her marrying a black man. As a Christian, Samuels embraced the principle of treating all people equally, noting, "I sincerely bought into all of it." In addition, her father, her grandfather, and her father were well known in her hometown as fair businessmen. And the reason she was telling me this is because I asked her, "How did you come to be such a progressive teacher?" She said, "I gotta give you my background." So after her marriage, she transferred to Richmond Public Schools and in 1971 accepted a position at Maggie Walker High School, a predominantly African American school in Richmond. Maggie Walker was a good fit, Samuels told me. And she recalls readily identifying with the students because they had a lot of energy and a quick wit like hers. Samuels taught English and literature and used this framework to discuss controversial issues regarding race and civil rights. In 1977, shortly after Roots aired on national television, Samuels used the film as a foundation for discussion on race. And so, is everyone in here familiar with the film Roots? Have you seen it? Raise your hand. Seen the film or read the book? Okay. As I was thinking about my talk, Lori told me to make sure, don't take for granted that everyone has seen it, and you know, everyone's not my age. So that's why I asked that question. But Samuels recalled that her black students came to class the next day very upset in seeing those portrayals of enslaved black people. At the same time, she said that her white students did not want to be blamed for the way that blacks had been treated, or that they didn't want to be blamed for anything that their ancestors may have done. So these reactions provided a teachable moment, she told me. And it forced her students and her to really discuss the historical legacy of slavery. And she had never thought about doing that before. And from that point on, she tells me that she started using literature as a way to teach about race. And we did, I think my interview with her was about 2.5 hours. And she shared many examples of how she used literature to teach. But Roots was the main one that she talked about. As in K through 12, higher education is also replete with examples of pedagogical and administrative activism. I turn now to the story of Walter Nathaniel Ridley, UVA's first black graduate. When the Curry School of Education Dean Lindley Stiles invited Walter Ridley to apply to UVA in 1950, Ridley was serving as a professor and department head of psychology at Virginia State College, now Virginia State University. And according to one of Ridley's students, a man named Roosevelt Wright, Ridley told him that he'd met Dean Stiles a week or so earlier at an event in Virginia State, in Petersburg, Virginia. And during that event, Ridley told Stiles that he'd like him to become a graduate of UVA. Ridley had already completed some of his graduate work at Ohio State and the University of Minnesota, but he believed that he should be permitted to enroll in UVA since he was a resident of Virginia, and he said that his family had paid taxes. And we know that several southern states paid tuition to send black students to school in the North because they were prohibited from attending schools in the South. And in Virginia, this practice was codified into law with the 1936 Dowell Act, also known as the Educational Equality Act. So this has been fascinating to me too in our studies. often I would go to teachers' homes in places like Chester, South Carolina, Rock Hill, South Carolina, Lynchburg. And as we're setting up the camera and everything, we look up on the wall and we see their bachelor's degree. New York University, Columbia University, Teachers College, Harvard. And I would like, how did you even know about these places in 1962 or 1963? And they explained to me, it was because they didn't want me to go to the University of South Carolina. Okay? As a result, they paid for my tuition for me to get a degree at NYU. And if you think into one of the clips right here, Carolyn Mosby says the black teachers had more education. They were better educated. That's what she was talking about. That's what she was talking about. Right? So Ridley decided on UVA, and after that chance meeting in Petersburg. The rest is history. At age 41, Ridley applied to the EDD program and was accepted. He was an ideal candidate to desegregate the University of Virginia. First of all, he was older and would not mingle with those undergraduates. He had an impeccable academic record, and he would not stay on grounds. Notice I did not say campus. We don't say campus at UVA. We're told that we have to call it grounds. And he wouldn't stay on grounds, and so they didn't have to worry about him, mingling with the students. Still a professor at Virginia State, really did not move to Charlottesville. He commuted from Petersburg, making more than 90 trips back and forth. And it's a 90-mile drive from Petersburg to Charlottesville. While attending UVA, really made an impression on students and community members alike. And there's this legendary story that I hear about really all the time when I interview people, but I can't find out if it's completely true. Y'all want to hear the story? Okay. The legendary story is about a Curry professor asking Ridley to teach statistics because the professor believed that Ridley was capable of doing so. Legend has it that black custodians peered through the classroom window as Ridley taught the white students, with the white professor looking on. When Ridley left the classroom, the custodians shed tears of happiness and expressed to Ridley the pride they felt for him that day. Ridley was an excellent student who received all A's, so this story could be true, with the exception of one B+. He completed his doctorate on June 15, 1953. His dissertation title was Prognostic Values of Freshman Tests Used at Virginia State College. Upon his graduation, Dean Lindley Stiles stated that Ridley has demonstrated to the highest degree the qualities of scholarship and gentlemanliness we expect of University of Virginia students. UVA President Colgate Darden also spoke very highly of Ridley on that day. At the University of Virginia, most of the discussions about Ridley revolve around his very brief time at the University of Virginia. However, his greatest accomplishments to the civil rights movement as an educator occurred during his presidency of Elizabeth City State College from 1958 to 1968. Ridley was a charismatic figure, and according to my interviewees, he ran the school like the all-knowing Oz. On any given morning, I don't have to tell you the story, but this is what everyone told me. On any given morning, he could be observed walking his 2 German shepherds across the immaculate campus, and he would be up at like 7 a.m. in the morning doing this. You know why he was doing it? He wanted to make sure that every light was on in their instructional buildings, because he was always trying to secure additional funding from the state. And he knew that if they weren't using all of those classrooms, the funding would not be forthcoming. So he wanted to make sure that someone was in a classroom at all times, that those lights were on in the morning. I've heard a variety of stories about Ridley's activism. Elizabeth City State College basketball coach Robert Vaughn, and Robert Vaughn is right here, I like his hat right here too, and I'm interviewing him, was a coach at Elizabeth City State College while Ridley was there. And Robert Vaughn now, I think is like 96 years old. When I interviewed him, he was 2 years ago. He was very sharp. Vaughn informed me that Ridley never participated in civil rights marches, but that behind the scenes, he was always pushing the levers for black equality in Elizabeth City and throughout North Carolina. And on several occasions, he even asked Coach Vaughn to participate in civil rights activities. Well, he didn't ask Coach Vaughn to participate in civil rights activities. He told Coach Vaughn to participate in civil rights activities. And that's what Coach Vaughn told me. And by the way, this is an aside. Ridley fired Coach Vaughn 8 times. So, but he would, call him back the next day and say, "You have your job back." So they had that kind of relationship. So it's an interesting man indeed. However, Ridley was perhaps best known for a course that he taught each spring for seniors who were soon to graduate from Elizabeth City College, State College. And it was called Contemporary Living. All students had to take it, no way out. The course taught students how to apply what they had learned in college to everyday life. Students in Ridley's course were required to be on time for class. Some students reported that if they were late, they would just turn back around because they didn't want to do it really. They had to dress appropriately, speak the proper English, and think quickly on their feet. And Ridley saw this course as a way to prepare students to participate in the civil rights movement and overcome the obstacles that they would undoubtedly face in the real world. He never pushed his students to participate in civil rights activities, but he expected them to be involved in the movement. One of my favorite interviews is of a man named Jim Wright. Jim Wright, or James Wright, is a good friend. I was introduced to him actually by my brother who works with him. And I'd like to share a clip of this interview just to give you a sense of what the interview was like. But not only that, to also show you that many of these teachers still have possession of the materials that they use in their classroom during the civil rights and post-civil rights period.
You taught history and social studies.
I taught at Eau Claire High School. My first course was world history. In fact, that's the textbook. I think that's the one that I used there, Men and Nations.
Yeah. Okay.
That was the first year of teaching. My second year of teaching, I believe I had civics and U.S. history. And then the third year thereafter, I developed what we then called minorities in American history.
What kind of teaching style did you have? Did you lecture, or did you do kind of hands-on group activity work?
All of the above. Here, right in the sign. Here we are. Now, does that say A, read and research report? Let me see, gosh, this is dated November 3rd, 1977. And questions or transcript I did from a film script on slavery in the U.S., part 1.
What made you keep all of these materials?
I really can't pinpoint it.
Mm-hmm.
However, I have always, since my earliest remembrance, would keep material. But one day, in one of my black history classes, Black Experience, Black Studies, and we use different names.
Yes.
I was playing either this album by Malcolm X or the Ballad of the Bullets. I have both of them. I was playing it in class, and Paul Stevens, who was the principal, he's a good guy, a real good guy. He thought highly of me. In fact, he thought I should have been doing things that I didn't think so, but he was just going through the building one day, and he walked into my classroom, my Black Studies class, and at the very time he walked in, Malcolm X was berating white folk. Blonde hair, blue eyes. And Paul Stevens looked at me and looked at the class. He said, well, I guess I don't belong in here. Ashmore, you may be familiar with him. Of course, one of my favorite books, Robert Elliott Brown, The Glorious Failure.
Yes.
He was
Yes.
doing, well, you're familiar with him. Oh, here's the Klan stuff from your county.
So where did you develop, or where did you get your love for African American history? Did that start as a child, or when you got in junior high or high school?
Derrick, the best way to answer that I can think of at the moment, I don't remember when I didn't have it.
Okay.
Mr. Wright has become a very good friend of mine. I talk to him at least once once a month, and we brought him up to the University of Virginia this summer to talk with teachers, and they were very inspired by it, as I was. Mr. Wright drew his inspiration from college professors that he had at South Carolina State College, and he ended up developing a course at Eau Claire High School, and the course was on African American history and on minorities in history. And Mr. Wright told me that he engaged in kind of a activist pedagogy through using quizzes, taking students to see films, historical films, and just having them read texts that weren't assigned to them, that were not assigned to them from the school. So he would bring in outside materials. And I asked Mr. Wright, do you consider yourself an activist? And he said that he did. He said he felt that, just him as an African American teacher, teaching his students black, white, at that time in South Carolina, Black history was a form of activism. So our search for teachers' pedagogy of activism is guided by an African proverb. And one of my graduate students gave me this, so I'm not going to take the credit from it. And her name is Alexis. And the proverb is, whenever an elder dies, a library burns down. 50 years after the Civil Rights Movement, the students of that era are now in their late 60s through their 70s. Their teachers who are still with us are fewer in number and in their 80s and 90s, in some cases 100 years or older. In the time period covered by our study, young people and their teachers were in the midst of the most profound social movement of the 20th century. The ideals of democracy, freedom, and liberation were integral to the social milieu of the time. These ideas were not disconnected from the pedagogy and learning taking place in schools, but were instead a central part of education. The stories presented here, along with many other stories recounting teachers' lives, pedagogical influences, and classroom approaches, highlight a vital but often overlooked dimension of education and the Civil Rights Movement. Eliciting and documenting these stories not only supports the notion of teachers as activists, but also illuminates the influential role teachers can play in contemporary movements for civil rights and social justice. It is my hope that these narratives will remind the current generations of their own vital role as teachers and activists. Thank you.